Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for another one of our live videos today. Today, we are going to be speaking with Amy Donahue with River City Company and Ben Pitts, a commercial realtor, about rent relief and the sorts of situations folks can look at under the current circumstances with COVID going on. We're going to have Q&A open as we normally do from the start. So if you have questions, feel free to pop them in there. And otherwise, I'm going to turn it over to Amy and Ben. Welcome, guys.
Thanks.
Hey, good afternoon.
Thanks for being here. Ben, do you want to talk a little bit about just sort of the sort of general situations that people are looking at with rent, both from a landlord and a tenant perspective right now, and some of the solutions people have been coming up with?
Sure. Obviously, with businesses closing or with limited operations, there's a cash flow issue for a lot of tenants. And those cash flow issues very quickly become cash flow issues for landlords. And so recognizing that both are facing cash flow issues from coronavirus, and also recognizing that the landlord-tenant relationship is a partnership in many ways, that's the place to start for any solution. And there are two key elements to addressing those cash flow issues for the tenants, and they typically include deferring rent and then recapturing rent. And there are various ways to defer it and various ways to recapture it. Deferral might be complete rent abatement for some period of time, or it might be partial rent abatement for some period of time, to help landlords with some of those cash flow needs that they can't defer. A lot of banks are working with landlords to address issues on mortgage payments, realizing that those landlords are not getting rent payments. But even with those, even with that help, there's still some cash flow needs that the landlord might have just to service the property, keep the lights on, keep the elevators working, keep the parking lot safe and clear of debris, stuff like that. So some landlords may need some cash flow, some partial rent for some period of time. Some may be able to abate the entire rent payment for some period of time.
Okay. Do you guys have recommendations on if you are a tenant, how to approach this with the property owner?
So I would say, and Ben and his team have put out some great information and resources about sort of working through this process. And I will echo that, Ben made a point, and it's particularly important that this sort of situation needs to be viewed as a relationship, right? It is a relationship between the tenant and the property owner. And how do we figure out something that is as manageable as we can in this moment for both entities, right? Because both entities have skin in the game. Both entities have, payroll to make, right? And vendors to pay and banks to pay, right? So it's, both folks are mutually dependent upon one another to be successful in good times and in tough times. So, from our perspective, River City Company, we are an economic development nonprofit. It is our mission, right, to see to the health of downtown Chattanooga. But we're also in a unique position in this space because we do own some property and have some tenants. And so this, situation was very real for us in a lot of ways, including how our tenants were going to fare through this. And so I think the most important thing that both tenants and landlords need to do is, if you haven't already be talking, you need to talk today. You need to pick up the phone, whichever party initiates it. But you don't need to wait until, things are incredibly dire, right? We know this is going to be a tough situation for everyone. And figuring out a path forward is going to be something that it's going to be much, so a very one-on-one, because different tenants have different needs. They rent different size spaces. They pay different levels of, things like CAM, which is common area maintenance, right? And so all of those things are different for different tenants. And so the thing to do is to make sure you're talking early, you're talking often. This situations feels like, sort of it changes every day almost, and opportunities change, and the outlook of your business can, change as rapidly. So we would definitely say, make sure you're talking today. Please don't wait until, it's the day before, a rent payment is due, or a day before, your, banknote is due, to have that conversation.
And we've seen a lot of legislation and a lot of aid coming out both at the federal, state, and local level. Have you do you have any recommendations, or have you seen people being able to take advantage of any of that, either as a renter or as a property owner?
Yes, and I would encourage landlords and tenants both to contact their bankers about the payroll protection plan, which is a part of the CARES Act. The payroll protection plan is a loan, an SBA loan that's forgivable to the extent that it is used for payroll, rent, mortgage interest, or utilities. And obviously the key one for this discussion is that rent payment for the tenant and the mortgage interest payment for the landlords. It's there's some limitations. It's designed for small businesses to be able to stay in business. So it's limited to businesses with 500 or fewer employees. And it's designed to help through June 30th. And it's retroactive to February 15. Most, I would say, small businesses are already familiar with this program, and they are currently discussing in Washington the additional funds for this. I think they're talking about adding $250 million or $1 billion to the $350 billion that's already been appropriated for this. And again, it's going to be, the application process is through banks. It's an SBA form. I know that some people there are some reports of people running into administrative issues with this. I would say you've got to become your own champion. You've got to push your banker, call, follow up until you get the money that you need. And we anticipate that that'll provide a lot of help for a lot of businesses and a lot of landlords.
Have you guys personally seen a lot of situations of landlords and tenants coming to some sort of agreement since all this started?
Yes. A lot of our clients on the landlord side started contacting tenants as soon as they realized that businesses were going to be shut down, and started trying to offer standardized plans, some standardized approach to the rent relief. And a lot of tenants contacted their landlords if they hadn't heard from them. And there are various kinds of deals that have been worked out between landlords and tenants. As Amy mentioned, different tenants have different situations. For example, if you're a workout facility, I think you closed earlier than a lot of the retail businesses. And if you're an essential business, you may not be closed at all. Your revenues may be down 50%. So maybe your landlord's willing to do a 50% deferral on something like that. The deals that we've seen have mostly involved rent abatement for 2 months or maybe 3 months, and most of the landlords seem to be getting some help on the same terms, 2 months or 3 months mortgage payment deferral, and that seems to work pretty well. There are some corporate tenants who are unilaterally contacting landlords and saying, we are not paying, they're not negotiating. Those situations are, again, those are usually larger corporations, and they are ignoring the partnership that we described earlier. But yes, we are seeing a lot of deals worked out with landlords and tenants. Everybody seems to be cooperating to find a mutually acceptable solution.
Jeremy, and I would echo what Ben is saying. We've talked to several, property owners and tenants in downtown Chattanooga, because obviously that is our purview in our mission area. And the majority of folks are working together, which is a great thing to hear, because, I think this is a very unique situation. This is not, a particular business or a particular landlord that's just, found trouble for some reason. This is everyone. And so I think individuals are seeing that. Property owners know that it doesn't, do them any good to, have mass vacancies at one time. And so I think, again, on the whole, most individuals both on the landlord side and on the tenant side, realize that it will be better in the long run if there can be some conversations now. And again, some of those, sort of kind of understandings that are met right now again. So, and to Ben's point, we're seeing most folks that we talk to are, sort of making plans for the short term, so for, 2 to 4 month range. And then the idea, of course, is, as this situation changes and evolves, that, you revisit often. And so, Ben has spoken a lot about, rent deferral and what that looks like. But we're seeing a lot of, again, sort of unique sort of solutions around recapture. So the idea is, you can have a situation where you defer rent for a certain period of time, but then you work out a recapture strategy. So that might be that, when you're back in business as a tenant, for a certain amount of time, maybe you're paying, your rent as normal. And then maybe that ticks up that you're paying, 25%, more for a certain period of time until that missed, rent is fully recaptured. Or maybe your existing lease is extended by 2 to 4 months. So that's another option as well. So again, there's options for deferral, there's options for recapture. And again, it's one of those things that we highly encourage that tenants and property owners work out those options. So again, when the time comes that we can all get back to a little more normal, that tenants can reopen, that they can start providing their services quickly, and that landlords can then, again, can sort of move into the space where, they're receiving, payment for their facilities, as described in their lease.
Are we seeing similar terms for property owners when it comes to mortgages? Deferment is great, but again, when we come out on the other side of this, if someone has been getting either greatly reduced or zero income for a period of time, having to make up all of the back mortgage payments that occurred during that period could be a little difficult. So are we seeing banks being willing to work something out for property owners as well?
Yeah, for the most part, I think, banks are open to some kind of deferral, and those terms are varying exactly how they're doing that. But the choices for banks are either work out something or enforce the mortgage provisions, and that's not a great option at this point, because and there will be some foreclosures that come from COVID. I'm sure some landlords are going to be too cash strapped to make it, even with help. But for the most part, banks, they don't want to own real estate, and they're not in the business of owning real estate. They want to make loans. They want the loans to be paid, and the way to make sure that happens, or to maximize the likelihood that that's going to happen, is to work with landlords right now while they're cash strapped, who are working with tenants who are cash strapped, until it all returns to some semblance of normal. And again, banks are, in what we're seeing, banks are very willing to work with landlords, especially landlords who have good credit and have been good loan customers for banks for a while. Again, it gets back to that relationship we were talking about earlier.
And there's not a one size fits all solution for tenants, for landlords, for banks. In some ways, I know that would make the situation a little easier to manage, but I think, like Ben said, whether you're a tenant or a property owner, you're going to have to advocate for, your business and what your needs are, what your financial position is. And, again, sort of see what solution you can, come up with, again, to make sure that, you're meeting your immediate needs. And again, as you move forward, you can do that as well.
A couple of other things that tenants might want to keep in mind. Two things. One, well, both sides should keep this in mind. You want something in writing. And a lot of times a letter agreement might be sufficient, but you ought to check with your attorney. You may need a more formal lease amendment to achieve what you're trying to achieve. And you should also, just in general, contact your attorney, let them know what you're trying to do and why and how, and see if they've got any advice specifics. You need to review the lease. Both sides need to understand the context that they're operating in. So the place to start is the lease. Tenants are going to look for a force majeure provision in the lease, which basically may address the tenant's right to not pay rent during something like coronavirus. I'm not going to get into the legal analysis of whether or not coronavirus would trigger a force majeure provision, but that's something that tenants should look for, landlords should be aware of, and both should talk to their attorneys about.
Sorry.
One other thing I was just going to say,
go ahead, Ben.
too, tenants should be willing to maintain confidentiality about their agreement with their landlord. As Amy's pointed out a couple of times, it's not one size fits all. And a landlord may need to work out different terms for different tenants. We talked about how workout facilities closed before anybody else. We talked about how restaurants are operating maybe at half speed or 3/4 speed now by doing carry out and curbside business. So what a landlord does for a workout facility, depending on when they're able to reopen, and what a landlord does for a restaurant, even in the same center, those two tenants may need completely different things, and tenants should be focused on what works for them and their business, and not what some other tenant got. And they've got to recognize that the landlord's got to produce solutions, different solutions for different tenants.
Sure, and you mentioned relationships with banks and lending institutions. We did have one question come through. It appears someone banks with a credit union and they can't give PPP loans. But they seem to be having issues getting other banks to work with them because they're not a customer. Is this something you're seeing happen? And if so, do you have advice for how people should handle this?
Yeah, I've heard of that a couple of times. There are some banks out there that are, I've heard of people experiencing similar circumstances. What I would say is just be persistent and call banks. I don't want to get into specific banking recommendations. I don't think that's appropriate in this session, but I do know of at least one bank that has made or has processed PPP loans with people that did not have a previous banking relationship. And there are some resources out there. I would contact the SBA directly and ask them if they can refer lenders because it's my understanding that any FDIC insured lender could make this loan if they chose to. But again, I would start with the SBA because that's where the it's being processed from the federal level.
And I'll just interject here. If folks are looking for a place to apply for those loans, I believe we have a list on our website under the resources of institutions that are working through the various different loans and assistance that people can apply for. So feel free to check there as well. Okay, is there anything we haven't covered that you guys want to include here before we go?
You know, while regular communication is important, I think it's important to try to come up with a plan that envisions the whole scope that maybe addresses some of the contingencies. I know it's hard to tell how long it's going to be like this. I anticipate some businesses will start to reopen in May, just based on everything that I'm hearing. That I think there'll be a lot of restrictions on that. So landlords and tenants should both consider how long they think this will last for the particular tenant, how they think it'll come back, and address contingencies for that. They don't want to have to renegotiate every month, but they should communicate regularly throughout this. And when you define contingencies, they need to be real specific and they need to be objective so that there's no debate on whether or not a contingency has been triggered. You know, there are things like some of the downtown businesses may not expect to be back up to anything like normal cash flows until the offices are open downtown again. And so an example of a contingency might be when one of the major downtown employers no longer has a work from home policy as a day-to-day policy. Again, communication is key. You know, we're April 16th now. So most landlords and tenants have probably at least communicated about April rent by now. But if you haven't, then call your landlord, call your tenants as soon as possible.
Yeah, and the only other thing that I would add is Ben has already said it, but you know, we want to keep all of our friends that are attorneys in business, but of course, you know, the suggestions that, you know, we made today are general and of course don't constitute, you know, legal advice. So really, you know, it's a great time to bring in, you know, an attorney, you know, whether it was attorney who helps you with your lease or another if that's not an option, but really having that legal advice, getting, like Ben said, any sort of agreement in writing. And also too, I mean, if you're a tenant, you know your business, you know who your customers are, you know how they behave, you know how they patron your business. And so in terms of, trying to figure out a creative sort of solution or some parameters around sort of the negotiations you're having, you know more of when your business will, begin to pick up and really look like normal again. And so like the example that Ben gave on the contingency about an employer opening, that's a great example. And that's something that you would know for your business. So again, you are your best advocate. And again, what we are seeing is that, sort of the trifecta of tenants, property owners, and banks all know that this relationship is, mutually beneficial and trying to figure out a path. And so we just encourage, everyone in this time to really, think through creative solutions, because, we all want to get back to business essentially. And I think that we're all there. So the ability to work together is crucial, and we're seeing that, and we hope to see more of that.
All right. Thank you both. If people have questions after the fact, where would they go to possibly connect with either of your organizations and get some answers potentially?
I'd be happy to receive calls at 423-826-8336. That's my direct dial. That'll ring my office phone and my cell phone simultaneously. And you can email me at bpitts@waldorf.com. That's BPITTS at WALLDORF.com.
And the same for me, happy to answer whatever calls. We have a great team at River City, so there may be someone who on the staff is much more knowledgeable than myself, and I'm happy to pass that along. So my direct dial is 664-4831, and it's A Donahue, ADONAHUE at rivercitycompany.com.
All right, thank you both so much. And as usual, folks know where to reach us at the Chamber. We will, as I said, post this after the fact for people who couldn't attend in person. And we encourage folks, if they have further questions, to ask them in the comments there. Thanks again, both of you. Some really good information, I think, for all of our members out there.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thanks.